Starting today, I'll be living with my parents. If you don't like it, you can just divorce me and leave." George stood boldly in front of me, a provocative smile playing on his face. "If that's the case, you're fired. Get out of the company." I told George, my heart's content laid bare. With a small sigh and a chilly gaze, I glared at George. Feeling my stare, George's body suddenly stiffened. Anxiety was evident on his face. "I, Sandra Hansen, am 44 years old. I run a company that manufactures transportation equipment and its parts. Founded by my grandfather, I am the third-generation president. Originally, I had no intention of taking over this family-run business. I wasn't particularly good at school and wanted a normal job, but I ended up working in an IT company. However, when I was 26, my parents died suddenly in an accident. I had a brother who loved research and was deep into his graduate studies. My father had named me as the next president in his will. After that, my life was like a roller coaster. I quit my job and started working at my father's company. The vice president acted as president, and I had to relearn everything from scratch. I worked tirelessly, sparing little time for sleep, and fervently learned about the company's products and management. At first, many treated me cautiously, but gradually they warmed up to me. I found enjoyment in my work and became president at the age of 40. I immersed myself in my job, putting the company first in my life. As my colleagues married off, I still had no partner. I always prioritized work over fun. For the company, I traveled domestically and internationally, so busy that I barely remember Christmas. Relatives began to press me about succession issues. Every time we met at family gatherings, they made inconsiderate comments like, "You better hurry up or you won't be able to have kids." Some people asked, "Aren't you lonely?" but their concern only led to more nagging. I responded with a wry smile and quickly left the situation. My dedication to the company paid off, and business was booming. Embracing IT technology was a key to success. As things eased, I finally had some leisure time. That's when I met George at a bowling alley. I started bowling on a light recommendation from a business associate, and it suited my personality. Now I have my own bowling ball and shoes and even participate in tournaments. George was a regular at the bowling alley. He was an engaging conversationalist, taught me many things I didn't know, and we even competed in pairs tournaments. After several meals together, he confessed his feelings, and we started a relationship. George is the same age as me but looks so young he's often mistaken for someone in his 20s. People sometimes mistake me for his older sister. Do I look that unreliable? He would blush with embarrassment whenever it happened. George has many hobbies. He doesn't just watch sports like baseball, soccer, and golf, he actively participates in them. Influenced by him, I started golfing too. Not just sports, he also invites me to concerts and Broadway performances. Through my interactions with George, I've encountered many new worlds and become passionate about them. Time spent with George is always exciting and fun. At 44, having a boyfriend for the first time might be making me a bit giddy. Amidst these fluttery feelings, George made an unexpected proposal. "I want you to meet my parents." I was at a loss for words at his sudden suggestion. "If we're going to get married, I want to introduce you to my parents." It was about 2 months since we officially started dating. It felt it was a bit soon, but I was also aware of my age. I wasn't without apprehension, but I also felt joy. I couldn't think of a reason to refuse. We visited George's parents' home a week later. The house was orderly and filled with a pleasant scent. In the living room, George's father and mother warmly welcomed us. George's mother had an elegant air, her hair dyed a beautiful shade of purple. "How lucky my son is to be dating such a lovely lady," she said, all smiles. "You are truly a wonderful young woman." Blushing from their compliments, I felt a bit embarrassed. George's parents continued to praise me, making my face turn red. George stood beside me, looking proud, "That right, Mama. It's rare to find someone like her at 44 years old," he said with a smile, though I felt a bit uncomfortable with his words. Suddenly, a wave of anxiety washed over me. But George and his parents were laughing happily together. With such wonderful parents, I felt we could build a good relationship after marriage. The earlier anxiety gradually faded. However, hearing George call his parents Mama and Papa made me ponder. I used to call my parents the same when I was young, but is it common for an adult man to do so? It seemed unusual to me. I may be unaware of common societal norms myself. Having lost my parents early and devoted myself to my work, I realize I lack common social knowledge. The discomfort I felt towards George may be due to my own deviation from common sense, and I tried not to dwell on it. George likely has a good relationship with his parents. He often praises his mother, which is not a bad thing. However, when we were talking about cooking, George made a slightly awkward comment. Mama's meat and potatoes is the best in the world. Furthermore, he lightly criticized the meat and potatoes I made. Yours is a bit. I couldn't keep smiling after hearing those words. This is a good opportunity to ask for the recipe. George's tone was different than usual. Why is he so condescending? Unaware of my confusion, he was laughing happily with his mother. George's mother took out a notebook and started writing down the recipe for meat and potatoes. Now you can make it like Mama. I wasn't sure whether to be happy or confused. Before I knew it, my smile had turned ambiguous. It had gotten completely dark outside, and as it was time to leave, the topic of marriage came up. I want to get married as soon as possible. It'll make life a bit easier, and being a part-timer, the income is tough. His sudden confession left me speechless. Huh? Pa, part-timer. I was shocked. George had previously explained that he was working in sales. I hadn't been very detailed about my own job either. I just mentioned that I worked at a manufacturing company. I had kept the fact that I was the president to myself because it was hard to discuss, but I never thought George was a part-timer. As I stood dumbfounded, George snapped back a bit angrily. You're mocking me because I'm 44, aren't you? There's a reason for this. According to George, his mother had always been frail and often ill. Furthermore, his father had become seriously ill 2 years ago and needed care. At that time, George was working in sales at a printing company but quit to care for his father. Since then, he has been dedicating himself to caregiving as a part-timer. It's tough for Mama to do caregiving alone, so I really wanted to support my parents. George showed tears as he spoke. I quietly listened to him. That's why I'm okay with being a part-timer. George glanced at his parents and nodded. But recently, Papa's condition has been improving, so I'm thinking about getting a job again. I'll do my best when I marry you, Sandra. George sniffled and murmured quietly. I blamed myself for feeling disappointed about him being a part-timer. He had chosen to care for his parents over his career. What a warm and kind person he is. The anxiety and doubts I had felt before were completely gone. A few days later, I made a proposal to George. Why don't you try applying for a mid-career position at my company? George was surprised by my sudden proposal. If you think it's a good idea. I made sure not to pressure him. He seemed a bit hesitant about working at the same company. Actually, the sales department is short-staffed. It would be helpful if you could join. I carefully chose my words while respecting his pride. It's a different department from mine. But George had other concerns. If I work, I want to earn properly. I want to reassure Mama. He was still focused on financial issues. Maybe he thought I wasn't earning enough. So I took out a tablet and showed him the job information from my company. I explained the details of the average salary, holidays, paid leave, and benefits. This might actually be good. He looked at the tablet screen intently and seemed a bit more interested. Since the company was planning to expand the sales department, George was hired. When George applied, I quickly informed my secretary about the matter. I might ask my secretary to handle any issues that arise in the future. I also asked my secretary to handle some updates on the website. Once George's hiring was confirmed, we planned to submit our marriage registration immediately. We decided not to have a wedding ceremony. I didn't want my relatives to know, and I wanted to keep the fact that I am the president a secret from George. I expected my in-laws to object, but surprisingly, they agreed smoothly. The only thing George's mother was concerned about was how often we would visit their home. Instead of a wedding, we decided to have a meal at a restaurant and postpone our honeymoon. George himself wasn't very enthusiastic about a honeymoon for some reason. I don't want to be away from Mama and Papa. Again, Mama and Papa. I still felt uncomfortable with his way of speaking. Regarding our new home, a real estate agent recommended a newly built single-family house, but considering George's status, I decided to decline. I thought it was better to avoid unnecessary spending. Ultimately, I decided to start a new life in the apartment I was living in. George agreed to it as well. It was probably because it's close to his parents' house. After we moved in together, I began to notice changes in George's behavior. Suddenly, he started acting as if he looked down on me. Which department do you belong to? George doesn't think of me as a business owner, and while I don't hide that fact, I preferred it to be as little known as possible. In such a situation, George made an unbelievable remark. "Well, it doesn't matter. I'm going to have you quit anyway." I was shocked by his words. Huh, quit. Who is quitting? What in the world is happening? Could it be that not George, but I am the one being asked to quit? A foreboding feeling stirred in my heart. George glanced at me and smirked maliciously. That unfamiliar smile was extremely unpleasant, and I shivered. Suddenly, I felt a chill. "Do you have any complaints?" George looked at me very coldly. My heart began to beat wildly. Holding my chest, I somehow managed to argue that I had no intention of quitting my job. Then, an idea struck me. Perhaps George wants children. "Are you thinking about when we have children? My company has excellent maternity and paternity leave policies." Before I could finish, George said something unbelievable. "I'm not thinking about children. I'm too busy taking care of Mama and Papa." I couldn't grasp the meaning of George's words and tilted my head. At that, George sighed heavily in exasperation. "That's what I said. It's my parents who need care." I was startled by George's sudden shout, but I tried to calm down and respond. "I know about your father's condition. But you said he's been doing better lately. That's why you returned to work, isn't it? Maybe he's okay now, but my parents are old." George showed intense anger. "And you're not worried about that? Such a heartless daughter-in-law." George's voice echoed throughout the room. I was confused and couldn't understand his reasoning. I tried to cool my head and sort out the situation. It seems George is planning to leave the care of his parents to me. Moreover, he seems to be planning to make me quit my job to focus on caregiving. As if his anger had subsided, George smiled slyly. "I'm not saying you should quit right away. It's better if we both work because it increases our income. It seems my income is important for now. From now on, we'll go back to my parents' house on days off. You'll come with me. Every week?" I was willing to help as much as I could, but being forced to provide care every week felt wrong. The most surprising thing was George's changed attitude. Before marriage, he was a cheerful person with many hobbies, always finding joy in anything. He was always a bright and reliable person. I was speechless at how much George had changed. I had just heard from the real estate agent that a new single-family home was being sold right next to his parents' house. Moreover, there were many inquiries about the property, and I had already completed the contract. I had hoped that moving there might change George. But visiting his parents' house was no longer something I looked forward to. However, his parents welcomed me warmly. "Welcome, we have cookies as a souvenir. Please, have some." My father-in-law laughed heartily, squinting his eyes. "I feel bad making you come here on your day off." My mother-in-law showed me careful consideration. No, not at all. Having you visit feels like our own daughter has come home. Seeing my mother-in-law tear up, my emotions surged. I felt I should proceed with the plan for the new house. I could manage with these in-laws. Every time I visited, my mother-in-law prepared my favorite sweets. I am always moved by her thoughtfulness. I dislike following George's orders, but seeing my mother-in-law's happy face soothes my heart. Since getting married, George and I have started visiting his parents' house at separate times. My work schedule made it difficult to visit every weekend. Sometimes I spend weekends in other regions for business trips. As a compensation, I decided to visit his parents' house on weekdays. One day, I headed to his parents' house. Since I had visited many times, I entered through the front door without ringing the intercom. "Excuse me," I said in a soft voice as I headed to the living room. I heard George's voice from the living room. He was supposed to be at work, so I wondered why he was there as I walked down the hallway. Just as I was about to enter the living room, an unsettling conversation reached my ears. I stopped in my tracks and peeked into the living room quietly. "She lacks consideration. She seems to struggle with household chores too," said my mother-in-law in a voice colder than I'd ever heard from her before. Couldn't there have been someone more suitable? It was hard to believe these harsh words were coming from the normally kind woman I knew. Her spiteful tone made my chest hurt and my breathing felt constricted. My hands grew cold, and I felt the blood drain from my face. She used to praise me all the time. To hear such words from my usually gentle mother-in-law, I didn't want to hear any more, yet I couldn't move. George's unpleasantly spoiled voice followed. "Sorry, Mama, but she's pretty sturdy, so she should be good for physical tasks." My resentment towards George deepened at his words. "It depends on how she's trained. If educated properly, she can be useful. What does he think I am? I am neither a servant nor a housekeeper. I'm putting up with her now because she contributes financially. I'm looking forward to the future." George and his mother continued their carefree conversation, laughing together. My face went pale with anger. Unable to stand, I leaned against the wall in the hallway for support. The shock from my mother-in-law's words was intense. What had all her previous kindness meant? I remembered my warm mother-in-law, who had baked cookies with me and shared pleasant times. Were all those simply cooking lessons? She was always smiling, sometimes moved to tears. Was all that an act? If so, hesitating to divorce, because of my concern for her, was pointless. The more I heard of George and his mother's conversation, the more it seemed they only viewed me as a caretaker. My mother-in-law then said something even more significant. "My approach is to keep her happy with compliments for now. That way, she would be pleased," my mother-in-law added. I felt dizzy at this revelation. Her harsh criticism continued relentlessly. "Take a leaf out of my book and manipulate her skillfully. By the way, I heard she's bought a house around here," George said cheerily. I wondered how they knew. There was a call from the real estate agent at home. I was taken aback. The real estate agent had called our home directly. Not specifying my mobile phone for contact was my oversight. "That's great. Now we can use her even more," my mother-in-law said with a vile laugh. Feeling nauseous, I quietly made my way to the entrance and left the house. My hand was numb from gripping my smartphone too hard. On my way home, I messaged George and his mother that I felt unwell. I thought I shouldn't have gotten married if it was going to be like this. The word divorce echoed in my mind. I'm the type to act immediately once I've made up my mind. I always prefer to regret doing something than regret doing nothing. In society, divorces right after marriage might be frowned upon. However, I felt it was far worse to stay with unpleasant people, and that acting sooner was the best course. I couldn't stand life with George any longer. I promptly prepared the divorce papers. I also planned to cancel the contract for the new house. If not handled efficiently, I could lose valuable assets due to property division and compensation issues. However, I was confident there wouldn't be a problem using George's lack of morals to my advantage. I have a reliable lawyer and a trustworthy secretary on my side. After making my decision, I became even more cautious in my actions. Without showing any defiance to George, I continued to feign obedience. According to my secretary, George had been causing multiple problems at the company. This was just the tip of the iceberg. A mere divorce might not completely sever ties with George. After resolving the company issues, I wanted to move forward with the divorce quickly. And I intended to keep my role as president a secret. If George or his parents found out before the divorce, it could lead to complications. Embarrassingly, I had confided all of George's issues to my secretary. With my secretary's help, I was preparing for the divorce. Living with George was suffocating. I felt like I wasn't truly alive. When I happened to meet George at the company one day, he approached me with a broad smile. Perfect timing. He grabbed my hand and pulled me into a nearby meeting room. "Is there something you're hiding from me?" he asked with a sly laugh. Fear coursed through me at his tone. "I heard you bought a house? I got the call that it's ready to move into." I sighed involuntarily. It was the house matter, after all. "Starting today, I'll be living with my parents. If you don't like it, you can just divorce me and leave." I was left dumbfounded. It seems I have no choice. It's time to seriously face George. George stood there smugly, puffing out his chest and sneering down at me as if I would quickly submit and obey. The time when I complied with George's demands for his mother's sake is over. I had trusted his parents, but now that I know his mother's true nature, I can no longer trust them at all. "If that's the case, then you're fired. Get out of the company." In response to George's angry shout, I smiled coolly and opened up about what was on my mind. "Ha!" George let out a perplexed sound, his face full of confusion. Perhaps he thought it was some strange joke. He quickly composed himself and smirked again. "Fired? What can you do? You're not even my boss. Have you lost your mind?" I sighed quietly and stared at him coldly. The moment he met my gaze, George's body stiffened. His expression was filled with anxiety. I took a deep breath and continued calmly. "You're the one who's mistaken. Not even knowing who the president of your own company is." I showed George the company newsletter. It featured an interview with the president, my photo prominently displayed. After staring at the newsletter, George looked up at me in shock. "You're really the president. This must be a joke, right?" His face paled, and he murmured under his breath as his complexion turned ashen, "Have you finally realized?" George seemed to deflate, collapsing right there. I really didn't know. George was shaking and his voice quivered. "You didn't know? That's impossible. You just chose not to find out." He could have made an effort to know at any time. That newsletter was also available in the company's break rooms and cafeteria. A simple search on his smartphone or computer would have brought up my photo immediately. Even if the company website was deleted, my photo could be easily found. George simply had no interest. His lack of passion for his work had resulted in him being relegated to simple clerical tasks within the company rather than sales. He was only concerned about income, vacations, and benefits. My existence was of no consequence to him. But that was not enough for me. "This isn't the end. We still have to discuss our divorce." George was visibly shaken. "Hey, do you even understand what you're saying?" He must not have thought I would agree to a divorce. "Yes, I can't be the wife you want. So, I'm going to divorce you." I pulled out the divorce papers from my bag. I had been carrying them ever since I made up my mind. "Do you really understand what you're doing?" George looked incredulously between the divorce papers and me. I took out a pen and placed it on the table. "Sign it quickly." George's face went pale, and he froze. Oh, was that divorce me and leave just talk? Coming to his senses, George slammed the divorce papers on the table and hurriedly signed them. "Now we are strangers." I stated it calmly. "Don't come complaining to me later. Rebelling against your husband, you're a failure as a wife." George snapped back sullenly. "Lucky for me to get rid of a woman who prioritizes work over family so quickly." He continued to grumble as if to console himself. "Well, that's unfortunate," I responded coolly, unfazed. "What will you do after the divorce? Can you imagine how sad my parents will be? Have you ever considered how lonely they will feel without your visits?" "Lonely," he says. They spoke ill of me behind my back. Anger boiled within me. I was too angry to speak smoothly. I wanted to lash out at George at that moment, but I just gritted my teeth and glared at him. Taking advantage of my silence, George became more aggressive. "Poor thing, Mama just messaged me. I'm so hungry I can't eat." What does that even mean? There are stores and supermarkets near their house. Go back to my parents' house. You can still make amends. George directed from a place of superiority. His parents are capable of moving, they don't need care. It's just their indulgence. I've reached my limit. We are strangers now, and I have an important meeting today. I finally managed to squeeze out the words. My anger reached its peak, bringing me back to calm. "If it's that important, you should take a day off and take care of it yourself. I will never sacrifice myself for George or his parents. I can't leave my important company for something like this. I've been patient and obedient so far, but I've reached my limit." George seemed surprised that I countered, stepping back. "What? Defying me now? Despite being a wife?" "I've said it many times, but I'm no longer his wife. And George is clearly old-fashioned. He truly believes that a wife should be submissive to her husband. Moreover, he only demands things that are convenient for him." "What do you mean by despite being a wife? How great do you think you are?" I confronted George without holding back, pressing him for an answer. George clenched his teeth in frustration. "She's not my mother. Can't you think of handling it yourself before leaving it to someone else?" If he's really concerned about his mother, George should take time off to care for her. His job involves organizing supplies within the company, nothing urgent. He has no crucial appointments with outsiders, and he could easily take a day off if he talked to his boss, yet he tries to push the responsibility onto me. If his mother's condition was truly serious, it would be different. He just wants to control me. Why should I take time off work to do that? Are you that dependent on someone else for your parents' care? George's self-centered logic seems never-ending. Listen carefully. Taking care of Mama and Papa is your responsibility. I'm tired of hearing Mama and Papa. What are you expecting from me? Honestly, I wasn't expecting an answer, but I asked George anyway. George responded with a dismissive snort. "You should take over the care of my parents." I couldn't believe George would say something so absurd. How audacious can he be? "You should take a day off and go yourself." I'm a stranger now, so I won't be going. I made a rational suggestion to George. George suddenly choked up. He seemed at a loss for words. The problem with his mother should be dealt with by him taking time off, not by dumping it on me. It's utterly inhumane to push the responsibility onto me and complain. You just needed someone, anyone, to take care of your parents, right? George opened and closed his mouth, shaking his head. His face turned pale. That's not true. If I had known you were the president, I wouldn't have asked you to do caregiving. Just moments ago, he was saying despite being a wife, and now he quickly changes his tune. It's clear he just wants to use me for convenience. So now, he's trying to sweet-talk me. But with his next words, George exposed his own contradiction. Well, if there was money, we could hire someone, right? Ultimately, that's the crux of the issue. George relies on others a lot. So you're just going to leave the caregiving to someone else and do nothing but have fun? That's not what I mean, George replied with a smile, countering my statement. If they had managed to manipulate me more skillfully, that might have been a possible future. Thinking about it sends chills down my spine. What if I hadn't known the true nature of George's parents? I might have happily agreed to his proposal. There was also the option of George dedicating himself to caregiving while I supported the household financially. He gave up that opportunity himself. For me, it might have been a fortunate mishap. George looked at me pleadingly, his eyes tearing up. Please, let's not divorce and live together again. We used to get along so well, didn't we? Let's go on dates to various places again. I remembered the various places we had dated. The places you took me were really charming and fun. George's expression brightened. He must have felt a glimmer of hope, but I was foolish to be deceived by that. After we got married, it was hell. I glanced at my watch deliberately. Well then, I have to prepare for a meeting. I'll contact you later about the dismissal. I lightly waved my hand and placed it on the door to leave the meeting room. As I opened the door, George suddenly grabbed my wrist. He looked at me with a gaze filled with anger. The conversation isn't over yet. Fired and divorced? I can't be okay with that. George, tears in his eyes, raised his voice in protest. And what? You're the president. His words mumbled towards the end, and he eventually let go of my hand. Actually, the divorce proposal was from George. It was their fault that I couldn't reveal I was the president. George probably didn't think I would accept the divorce. He must have thought that by threatening divorce, I would comply. And when he found out that I was actually the president, he must have been shocked. This is not how adults should act. George is clenching his teeth in frustration. He seems to regret his lost fortune, but that's not my problem. Your foolishness. At my words, George became enraged and raised his voice. Are you kidding me? Can a major company's president fire an employee just because of a divorce? That's outrageous. George puffed out his chest as if he was making a legitimate argument. His thinking is too immature. My opinions are not understood, and he just seems to be making selfish demands. I'm so tired of dealing with him that I inadvertently covered my face. Seeing this, George grinned, showing his white teeth. Got to the point, didn't I? Let's see what happens if I get serious. You'll be in trouble. I'm just tired. I thought about staying silent, but I pulled a piece of paper from my bag. I read the names written on it. Ms. Johnson from General Affairs, Ms. Stone from Sales, Ms. Baker, and Ms. Ford from Accounting. I said this much and looked at George. Sweat was beading on George's forehead. Shall I read all the other names too? George stepped back toward the wall. The people I just mentioned, they're the women you've been persistently bothering, aren't they? This information was brought to me by my secretary. The HR department received complaints, which my secretary relayed to me. Only my secretary knows that we were married in the company. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. That my husband had been approaching multiple female employees, and quite aggressively at that. Hearing this story made my face burn with embarrassment. I was just trying to get along with fellow employees. This is an unforgivable excuse. George must seriously think he can get away with this. You even invited them to a hotel, but what kind of interaction was that supposed to be? George just opened and closed his mouth, unable to speak. I have messages sent to his smartphone from female employees as evidence. The content is so embarrassing that it makes me blush. At this point, any excuse is meaningless. He deserves proper punishment. I have a duty to protect my employees. It is the president's responsibility to remove those who cause trouble for others. I firmly told George this. George hung his head weakly. To press him further, I pulled an envelope from my bag. This is from the accounting department. They've reported that your receipts might be fraudulently altered. I handed the envelope to George. He reluctantly took it, looking away in silence. He's a do-nothing mama's boy, a womanizer, and moreover, he's stingy. George has been a nuisance, not only to me but to many others. The fact that he's terrible is undeniable, but I believed him anyway. I'm disappointed in myself for misjudging people. Anyway, you are fired. You will be held accountable. I didn't stop as I opened the door to the conference room. This time, George didn't try to stop me. He was leaning against the wall, drained of strength. Well then, I hope you find happiness with your parents at home. George staggered and collapsed on the spot, muttering something, but I left him behind and exited the room. Shortly thereafter, my secretary brought me a formal report. Upon receiving it, I immediately initiated disciplinary dismissal procedures against George. I issued apologies in my name to the female employees who were affected, and through my secretary, I made sure they received proper mental care. I also receive regular updates on George's movements from a private detective agency through my secretary. According to the reports, after becoming unemployed, George returned to live with his parents. He started working again as a part-timer, but an unexpected event occurred. His father received a Care Level 2 certification, and soon after, his mother developed dementia. As a result, George had to take on the caregiving responsibilities for both parents. His mother sometimes wanders at night, and George spends many nights almost sleepless. His days are spent working, and his nights are consumed by caregiving. Please help, I need financial support. George has repeatedly reached out to me. Had our divorce been amicable, I might have considered helping. However, it's undeniable that George and his family treated me like a slave. There is no room for sympathy for such people. I always responded to George in a formal tone. I'm unable to assist you. Please refrain from further contact. I will take appropriate actions as necessary. After those words, the contact from George stopped. Having gone through the divorce with George, I decided never to marry again and chose to live alone. Though I purchased a new house, I am currently renting it out to others. I believe the property will increase in value over time, so I consider it a good investment. My job is stable, and the company's performance is improving. I see my work as my passion and am even more dedicated to it than before. However, I haven't been able to stop bowling, which George taught me. I participate in bowling tournaments and join community circles at the bowling alley. Most circle members are older than me and have rich life experiences, from which I learn a lot. Recently, a man around my age joined the circle. Unlike George, he is calm, reserved, and taciturn. Yet, the joy he shows when he scores a strike is charming, and I secretly enjoy watching him. Now, I tell myself that work is my life's purpose and live each day to the fullest. Believing that happiness will find me again someday, I hope for that day to come as I continue to work hard.
I decided to live with my sister and niece, so you should look for another cheap apartment as you are a stranger after all, David told me, and I was so shocked that my eyes widened. I was speechless with my mouth open. I never thought he didn't know this in-law's house is registered under my name. I don't mind having my name removed from the registry, but I made one suggestion before that. Leaving is an option, but in that case, I would like you to consider divorce, I replied with a smile. David gave a sarcastic smile and said, "My dad has passed away, and you are no longer valuable to me." He acted as if everything was permissible. "Don't expect any property division since you brought it up," he said authoritatively, and I sadly lowered my face and covered my mouth. "Go on and cry. Did you think I'll stop you? Lament being abandoned by your husband," he said. However, I was holding back desperately the laughter that was welling up, because David has no idea about the situation he is about to face. I immediately started thinking about a new place to live. Yes, that place would be perfect, I decided in my heart. An image of a high-rise apartment worth $1 million floated in my mind. I am Becky, 34 years old. I was about to take a new step toward the rest of my life. David is 2 years older than me, 36, and works at a high school. He works at a private girls' high school. David is relatively young among the male staff and seems to be popular with the students. Sometimes he receives letters from them, and on Valentine's Day, he gets several chocolates. Every time, David reacts as if it's bothersome. "You don't make that troubled face in front of the students, do you?" I ask, and he gives a wry smile. "Of course not. I wonder why they give me chocolates even though they know I'm married. It wouldn't hurt to accept them," I say, reminiscing about my high school days when I had a crush on a teacher more than 10 years my senior. That's dangerous. It would be a big problem if inappropriate rumors started at a girls' school, David says seriously. In this regard, David is very sincere. Even when he receives favorable looks from young students, he doesn't engage in inappropriate relationships, so I can feel at ease. David's seriousness probably comes from his father. Both of his parents were educators, and I feel their influence is significant. Currently, we live with David's parents at his childhood home. We planned to move out once we had a child, but unfortunately, we don't have any children yet. Moreover, the income I earn from my part-time job and the amount David contributes to the household don't leave much room for savings. Living with my in-laws is comfortable, and they are very warm towards me. My recent concern is the worsening condition of my father-in-law's legs. His ability to walk is deteriorating day by day, and he can't enjoy his walks as much as before. So we bought a wheelchair and tried to get him out as much as possible. I changed my job from a daytime position to an early morning shift at a bakery. This allows me to go for walks or shopping with my in-laws during the day. My parents have passed away, so I cherish my in-laws as if they were my own parents. They left me an inheritance, but I still wish they were alive. David has an older sister, Kim, who has a husband working for a major company and a 17-year-old daughter, Nicole. It's been 10 years since we got married, and Kim, who works, often leaves Nicole at our place. Thanks to that, Nicole and I have developed a close relationship. Nicole calls me Sister Becky and trusts me like her own sister. I was an only child, so it was very precious to have a sister-like presence in Nicole. Now that we don't have to take care of her at our in-laws, we still keep in touch frequently. However, my relationship with Kim isn't very good. Ever since the first time I met Kim when visiting David's parents, I never had a good impression of her. She laughed and said, "I thought he would choose someone cuter at our first meeting." Moreover, David didn't stand up for me at that time. If David's parents hadn't been upset by Kim's words, I might not have married David. David later said, "I don't choose people based on their looks. I believe that personality is the most important thing in marriage." However, those words didn't resonate with me much. Instead, the immediate anger from David's parents made me feel they cared about me. I wanted to be dutiful to David's parents as I couldn't be to my own. Lately, Kim has been coming back to the family home more frequently. She doesn't talk to me directly, but from conversations with David and his parents, it seems there are frequent conflicts between her and her husband. Despite both working, she's often pointed out for neglecting household chores, expected at least to handle cleaning. If I only worked a few hours part-time like Becky, I could manage housework too. But I work full-time, she sarcastically remarked, glancing at me. Kim often compares herself to me. For a long time, I didn't understand why, but it seems she's competing with me. Maybe Kim was upset because David's parents sided with me when we first met. Eventually, David defended me, which seemed to increase Kim's anger. "Well, we're getting by only because Mom is helping out. It would be impossible alone," David said, and Kim laughed proudly. "Without children and with Mom's help, it's natural you can manage household chores." "No, you're not managing. Kim is more capable, isn't she?" They laughed at me disdainfully. I caught my mother-in-law's eye watching them from a distance, and David quickly cleared his throat. However, Becky is doing her best. She's attentive, like taking care of my father with his bad legs. As I walked to the bedroom, leaving Kim surprised by his statement, I decided to contact Nicole. Nicole calmly responded, "Yes, Mom is wrong in this case." Despite having time, including when Nicole is at tutoring, the housework should be manageable. But it seems it's not being done. There's no sign of her being unfairly scolded. David typically sides with Kim. Kim is competitive with me, and David seems to harbor competitiveness towards his brother-in-law, who works at a top company. But as I see it, David is clearly lagging behind in this competition. His brother-in-law earns several times more than David. My point isn't about the amount earned, but how much one can spend on their family. I don't know how much David earns, nor does he know or show interest in my part-time income or savings. As long as we can get by on what he brings home, that's fine. I don't know what he does with the rest of his salary. However, there are nights he comes home late. He explains, "I was out drinking with work colleagues." Whether that's true or not, I can imagine David, who avoids even the slightest rumors among his students, having an affair. I never doubted him. David contributes $1,000 a month to our household. Normally, this amount would be challenging to sustain a household. This fact alone could be a seed for divorce or conflict. "This is my parents' home, so no need for rent," David says. "But $1,000 is a bit." I counter. "Then, how about asking my parents for living expenses?" He suggests. "That's not really the point." I say, but my true feelings don't seem to reach David. I don't expect David to support all three of us alone. However, I don't feel a sense of responsibility for his family in his actions. "You can say such things after you have children like your sister," he said, knowing it would hurt me. At that moment, I realized that although my husband cared for his sister, he did not show the same care for his wife. Meanwhile, my father-in-law's leg condition was gradually worsening. Our surroundings were all slopes, not suitable for wheelchair use. Why not consider moving? I suggested it to my in-laws when David was not around. But the budget, they responded. "We could use the funds from selling the house, and I can cover the additional mortgage payments," I offered, and my in-laws exchanged glances. "But Becky, that's a lot of money. You're already contributing more to the living expenses than David," my mother-in-law said with concern. "Don't worry," I reassured them. "I have an inheritance from my parents. If it can be used for my father-in-law and mother-in-law, my parents would be pleased," I explained. By then, my feelings for David might have almost disappeared. However, I felt affection for my in-laws and wished to continue living with them. We decided to move to a new home after discussing it with David's parents. Before moving, we made the house wheelchair accessible and installed handrails to ease my father-in-law's movement. I believe the new house, especially for my father-in-law, was much more comfortable than the previous one. In the old house, even moving to the toilet was a struggle, but now he could use it with ease. Initially hesitant, my in-laws felt relieved after I accepted a certain condition. That was to put the new house in my name and keep this fact from David. I had kept the existence of my inheritance from my parents a secret from David. If David knew about your assets, he would rely on you even more. "We can't allow that," my father-in-law said, showing his intention to protect me from relying on my parents' inheritance, which made me genuinely happy. I wish I had more strength. "I'm sorry for being a burden," my father-in-law apologized, but I waved it off. "Not at all. I look forward to our walks together every day," I told him, and he smiled gratefully. "Thank you," he said. However, after having difficulty walking, my father-in-law's appetite decreased, and he lost quite a bit of weight. I hoped the new, more accessible house would help him regain his former vitality. "What a lovely house," Kim commented while looking around during her visit. She tapped the handrail and added, "But these handrails are a bit in the way. They spoil the look. The safety and well-being of my father-in-law are much more important than the appearance," I counted, and Kim, displeased, huffed and left without another word. "We always leave the toilet lid open in our house. This is because lifting the lid is a significant burden for my father-in-law with his mobility issues. Therefore, we make sure to clean it regularly to prevent any bad odors. Despite the handrails, bending or leaning forward to lift the lid is painful for him, as he has complained. However, every time Kim uses the bathroom, she closes the toilet lid. No matter how much I explain, her behavior doesn't change. One day, after a loud noise, I rushed to find my father-in-law had fallen while trying to open the toilet lid. "I've asked you not to close the lid," I exclaimed to Kim, who arrived later, supporting my father-in-law. I couldn't forgive her, even if she was my sister-in-law. Fortunately, my father-in-law wasn't seriously injured, but that didn't mean there was no problem. Leaving the lid open isn't hygienic, and it's not good feng shui either. "You shouldn't leave the toilet lid open," Kim argued. Then, my usually calm mother-in-law retorted, "That doesn't matter. Do you want to injure your father?" "It's okay, Mom." Kim didn't mean to. "Really, it's exaggerating to say I caused my father's injury," Kim laughed off. But my mother-in-law's anger didn't subside, and she told Kim to leave the house. I thought we might live more peacefully. I momentarily felt relieved, but soon after, it was discovered that my father-in-law had cancer. The cancer had already metastasized throughout his body when found, leaving no room for treatment. Just half a year later, my father-in-law passed away. After the funeral, I was shocked by a conversation I overheard from the living room. "Does this mean you'll inherit the house now?" Kim was talking to someone. To which the reply was, I wonder. Shouldn't Mom inherit it?" That was undoubtedly David's voice. The expression on my mother-in-law's face, who was heading to the living room with me, froze. "But it's a relief, isn't it?" If his illness had dragged on, caregiving would have been tough, Kim said. "True. But we have a convenient housekeeper, so no worries," David continued. What a thing to say. "But maybe you're right," a laughing voice responded. Just as my mother-in-law reached to open the living room door, I firmly grasped her wrist. She was visibly angry, but I shook my head. "Should we move in here too?" Kim's cheerful laughter could be heard. I was undoubtedly furious. I had another reason to be angry with David. While organizing his suit for the funeral, I found receipts from dubious establishments and business cards with women's contact details. More of these were found when I searched his bag. These contacts were from afar, seemingly to avoid detection by school associates or students. Knowing he contributed little financially to the home while spending on such things fueled my anger. At that point, I was contemplating how to kick David out of the house. "It's decided that my sister and niece will live together, so you, an outsider, should look for a cheaper apartment," David suddenly told me a few days after a month-long memorial service. I was dumbfounded, not understanding what he was saying. At that time, I learned that Kim's discord with her brother-in-law had deepened, leading her to declare, "I'm moving back home." Kim seemed to think that if she and Nicole left, her brother-in-law would apologize. So that's the plan. While surprised by the turn of events that I was being kicked out, David was unaware of a crucial fact. This in-law house is in my name, despite the fact that I am shouldering a mortgage payment of $1,800. I had been pondering how to evict David, but then realized there were other options. Considering transferring ownership to David, I devised a plan and smiled slyly. "Leaving is an option, but in that case, I would like a divorce," I proposed. If I were to leave, divorce seemed fitting. Otherwise, I would end up at a disadvantage. Unaware of my intentions, David returned a spiteful smile. "My dad has passed away, and you are no longer valuable to me," he declared. He took on an unpleasant demeanor, thinking he was in a superior position. "Didn't expect any property division since you brought it up," he said condescendingly. I looked down and covered my mouth, replying with a trembling voice, "Understood." Hearing this, David laughed even louder. "Go on and cry. Did you think you'd be stopped? Lament being abandoned by your husband," he taunted. But I was desperately holding back laughter. The situation he was oblivious to, thinking he had the upper hand, was comical. Distracting David, I began thinking about my next place to live. Yes, that's ideal, I decided. I envisioned the $1 million high-rise apartment my parents left me. Recently, I was informed by the property management company that the family living in one of my properties was planning to move. It's one of several real estates left by my parents, and the rental income enriches my life. Especially the high-rise apartment my parents dreamed of holding a special place for them. I hadn't been particularly interested until now, but living in my parents' last dwelling might not be too bad. However, there's one concern. That is about my mother-in-law and Nicole, who will end up living in the same place as Kim and David. I continued to ponder how to rescue them. Then I will go to a facility as well, my mother-in-law declared when I informed her that I would be divorcing David and leaving. What? What are you talking about? Kim is coming back, David protested. Yes, if you say such things, Dad would be sad, Kim added. Dad would be sad? What would my mother-in-law think about Kim's words that trivialized the deceased father-in-law? However, at that moment, I came up with a plan. I whispered it to my mother-in-law, and we decided to proceed with the plan without letting the other two know. If they won't let me leave, I'll just have to be kicked out. With the divorce pending, I continued to live in my in-laws' house for the time being. Currently, I am living in the same living room with my mother-in-law. This is a temporary measure until I find a new place to live. When Kim and Nicole started living together, my mother-in-law and I put our plan into action. Why isn't there a dinner prepared for Dad tonight? My mother-in-law said at dinner, causing David, Kim, and Nicole to be astonished. What do you mean? Dad is no longer in this world. What are you talking about? David was confused. Kim was angry, and Nicole could not hide her concern. Each showed a different reaction. Although it was necessary to keep this plan secret from Nicole to avoid suspicion, it pained my heart. How can you say such a thing? Apologize to Dad. It's bad luck, isn't it, Dad? My mother-in-law spoke to the seed of the deceased father-in-law, creating an indescribable tension. I quietly prepared a meal for the deceased father-in-law. My mother-in-law continued to act as if he were still alive. If we closed the toilet lid, it would be inconvenient for Dad. The plan also served to admonish Kim and David for disrespecting the deceased. I also intended to see whether these two could ever take care of my mother-in-law in the future. Kim roughly grabbed my mother-in-law's hand and took her to the portrait. Why are you saying Dad is here? He's no longer in this world. Isn't that obvious from the portrait? Despite Kim's angry shouts, my mother-in-law calmly sat in front of the altar and quietly stared back at Kim. Dad is right here, she said while pointing to the portrait, as if she could feel his presence. She delivered these words calmly yet coldly to Kim. Your terrible words and attitude are also seen by Dad. Always, she said, making Kim visibly shiver. Stop it. Kim screamed and left the room. I had expected her to be the first to break. Mom has finally gone crazy, Kim complained. But when you take her to the doctor, they say there's nothing wrong, right? I counted, and Kim raised her voice in distress. Yes, outside she acts perfectly fine. In front of the neighbors, she's impeccable. I can't stand it anymore. Yes, but there's still a mortgage on this house, and without Mom's pension, we can't make the payments. I overheard them discussing secretly in the living room. While doing the dishes, I pretended not to hear while listening. Finding a facility is tough, and the costs are significant. Kim, can you bear those? They discussed. No way. That's impossible. We need to save for Nicole's college tuition until she graduates. It seemed they were more troubled by the financial burden than my mother-in-law's health. Truly disgraceful. Reaching my limit, I turned off the tap and joined their conversation. I found a new place to live. If you'd like, I can take my mother-in-law and care for her until we find an appropriate facility, I suggested, watching them look at each other before adding, also, about the mortgage on this house. I've been the one making the payments. Really? Is that so? David muttered to himself in a daze. The amount left after deducting living expenses from my part-time income is enough for the payment. I had anticipated David thinking that. He probably assumed, now that my sister's income is there, it will be easy. Pretending not to hear, I chuckled inwardly as I told him, "If your mother and I leave together, I'll transfer the property and loan payments to David." David simply replied, "Understood." At that moment, feeling relieved that my mother-in-law would be protected, a new development awaited us. However, it might have been a rather favorable turn of events for us. After returning home from high school, Nicole came to me with a serious concern. She had heard from a friend that her mother might be having an affair. Her friend had seen Kim walking arm in arm with a suited man one night, someone who wasn't Nicole's father. Upon further questioning, it turned out this happened while Nicole was at her tutoring session. It became clear that Kim's neglect of household duties wasn't due to parenting or work, but her affair. I assured Nicole I'll handle this matter and made her promise to keep it a secret. I immediately hired a detective to investigate Kim's affair. Perhaps she had let her guard down during the separation from her husband. Or maybe she was contemplating divorce. But her lapse came too soon. The legal divorce hadn't been finalized yet. Once the detective's evidence brought the affair to light, her brother-in-law initiated divorce proceedings. Nicole's father gained custody, and she went to live with him. Kim, along with her workplace lover, was sued for damages by her brother-in-law. Relieved, my mother-in-law and I left the in-laws' house and moved to a high-rise apartment worth $1 million, starting a new life. One evening, while we were enjoying our peaceful days, the intercom suddenly rang. Displayed on the screen were David and Kim. "What brings you here?" I asked nonchalantly, but David retorted, "Because you won't answer the phone." "I'll step outside," I informed my worried mother-in-law before heading out. I had no intention of inviting them into my home or letting them pass the entrance. "Just leave it be," I muttered to myself as I headed to the front hall. "We can't talk here," I said, and we drove to a nearby cafe. During the drive, David kept complaining, "How can you afford to live in such a fancy high-rise apartment?" "It's an inheritance from my parents. I just rented it out to others until now," I explained. "Why didn't you tell me something so important?" David pressed, but I calmly replied, "Was there a need to? I was paying the living expenses. Besides, this property is not part of the estate division." David was the one who denied the property division. It was clear they had no grounds to complain to me. Once we arrived at the cafe and settled at a table, the conversation predictably turned to the mortgage of the in-laws' house. "Why is it so high?" "A monthly payment of $1,800. David, trying to keep his voice down, was visibly furious. He must have wanted to scold me right there. I sipped my coffee leisurely and smiled gently. "That's the value of the property, isn't it?" I responded, to which David exploded, "This is no joke," and slammed the table. Kim tried to calm him as the surrounding patrons turned their gaze towards us. "Stop it." "But Becky, you should have mentioned such a high mortgage," Kim said. Their desperation almost made me laugh. No gratitude was shown to me for paying that amount all these years. "I wasn't asked. Besides, you left the title transfer mostly to me, right?" I said quietly, hinting that it's improper to complain only when inconvenienced. Considering Kim was facing compensation claims from her husband and the wife of her lover, I could somewhat understand their situation. Moreover, the affair being exposed at her workplace made her resign. From my perspective, it was all a result of her own making. I gently turned my gaze to Kim, and I said with a smile, "You've had it tough, haven't you?" "What do you mean?" "Because he doesn't contribute enough money to the household." "What?" Kim stared at David. Feeling the side glance, David vaguely responded, "Well, that. I see. It hasn't been long since we left." As I ambiguously spoke, realizing Kim might not yet understand, David said quietly, "Don't talk about unnecessary things," and glared at me. "Hey, what are you talking about?" Kim turned to me, demanding an explanation. I shrugged and pulled out some documents from my bag. He only gave $1,000 to the household and frequented places like this. I laid out dubious receipts and women's business cards on the table. What? What is this? What do you mean by going to places like this? Kim was more outraged than expected, loudly reading the names of the establishments. How foolish. Disgusting. Kim's exclamation triggered David's anger. What are you saying? You two engaged in such embarrassing acts of infidelity at your workplace. An ugly dispute unfolded before me, each critiquing the other's misdeeds. I sipped my coffee, quietly observing their argument. Concerned about a possible complaint from the cafe, I addressed David. Right. Sorry to interrupt your conversation. With that, David ceased his quarrel with Kim. Perhaps a unique communication between a long-time married couple. You were saying? He inquired. I almost forgot, but there's a popular tutoring school near this cafe. What? They looked at each other, then back at me, puzzled. It seems many students spend their pre-class time here, I whispered to David. See that uniform? Doesn't it look familiar? Wonder how many are around, including those in casual clothes? Suddenly, David stood up, causing a loud noise. He scanned the surroundings, noticing the onlookers. I could hear subdued laughter around us. It seemed my choice of cafe made sense to David and Kim. Just so you know, I wasn't the one who raised his voice. David remained standing, his face downturned, trembling. Thank you for exposing yourself. I'm looking forward to school tomorrow. I rested my cheek on my hand, gazing intently at David, and smirked. Before me, David crumbled to the floor. Eventually, David and Kim's in-law house was put on the market, and they moved to an old, small apartment. Kim struggled to find a new job, and David resigned from the girls' school. It seems there was a complaint from a parent about a problematic staff member. Even without the complaint, David would have resigned, but the call spread the rumor. I knew this because Nicole's friend attended the school David worked at and provided the information. As David feared, the story spread quickly. After hearing it from Nicole, my mother-in-law exclaimed, "What a pitiful pair," and I burst into laughter. Once, they came to us, relying on the inheritance I received and my mother-in-law's income. They came to apologize, but I told them, "You don't need to apologize anymore," and quickly sent them away. I still live with my mother-in-law, enjoying the company of Nicole, who often visits our high-rise apartment. She likes the view from the windows, similar to the vast sky my parents once admired. With the curtains wide open, our meals are always delightful. I hope to fulfill the filial duties to my mother-in-law that I couldn't to my parents, cherishing our life together. Still, 9 people is way too many. Are we all going to get along and play baseball or something? Ever since I was a child, I had harbored a dream. To live in a charming house like the ones in picture books and to play with a white dog in the garden. But reality was not so kind. Though I finally acquired a house of my own, when I returned from work, it had transformed, almost like a dormitory. I couldn't forgive what had happened. My name is Janet, a 32-year-old office worker. I had devoted myself to my job and worked hard. However, towards the end of my 20s, my friends started getting married one after another. I even went broke from the expenses at weddings. Gradually, I began to feel a sense of urgency and started to actively seek a partner. Janet, when will you show me grandchildren? My father would ask me the same question every time I visited home. Because of this, I grew reluctant to return, and my visits became less frequent. My mother passed away when I was young, and afterward, I was raised by my father, my brother, and my paternal grandparents. My brother married young and built his own house near our childhood home. He has 2 daughters, who are dear nieces to me. You have 2 adorable grandchildren already, so why do I need to have children? But still, you are. Each time, it turned into an argument. Then one day, my father had a traffic accident. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the situation was already severe, and my always energetic father passed away peacefully while our family watched over him. Dad, there was someone I wanted to introduce to you. At that time, I had a partner I met through friends. Recently, he had proposed and we had decided to get married. He tended to put on airs, but he was a kind-hearted person. His name was Steve, having lost both parents and my brother having his own new family. It's going to feel a bit lonely, isn't it? After the funeral, back at home, I murmured such thoughts while stroking my cat, Candy. You're not alone, Janet. From now on, I'm your family. Steve, who was beside me, said that, taking my hand gently. He was concerned about me and came to check on me. Let's build a happy family together. I believed I could have ordinary happiness. At that time, I couldn't even imagine what would happen next. Welcome, though it's a bit cramped. We were welcomed by Steve's parents when we visited for me to introduce myself to them. His mother was very active and cheerful. I felt a bit nervous as soon as I entered the room. I thought we would be meeting just his parents, but there were also his grandparents, Steve's brother, his wife, plus their 2 boys. Nice to meet you. There were so many people. Steve's family home, built by his grandfather, felt a bit old and run down. To be honest, it seemed quite ancient. However, his family welcomed me warmly despite my nervousness. On our way back, I said to Steve, there were so many people today. It must be even more chaotic during holidays and Christmas. He laughed and replied, really, it's cramped. I wonder how they manage to live there every day. I was genuinely surprised by his comment. Steve's family home wasn't particularly spacious. I had thought it was just coincidentally crowded that day. Wow, 8 people in that house. That's impressive. According to my husband, initially, it was just his parents and grandparents, 4 people living together. But one day, his unemployed brother suddenly moved in with his wife and kids. Well, I guess he'll move out once he finds a job, my husband said with a laugh. At that time, I just thought it must be tough for his family. Since getting married, we haven't been blessed with children, but we live a leisurely life with my husband and our cat, Candy. My husband helps with the household chores, and Candy is fond of him. Some time has passed since our marriage, but my brother-in-law's family still lives in the same house. The walls are filled with children's scribbles, and my mother-in-law has accepted the situation, laughing it off as a joke. Vanessa, my brother-in-law's wife, always looks tired. She is older than my brother-in-law and close to my age, so we developed a good relationship quickly. Hey, Vanessa, hurry up. Janet, don't just watch, we're out of beer. When I visit my in-laws, Vanessa and I are usually the only ones moving around. We were constantly busy, hardly having a moment to breathe. I wondered if this was the fate of a daughter-in-law, but thinking about Vanessa facing this daily was genuinely frightening. Since my brother-in-law doesn't work, Vanessa works full-time. It might be a bit rude, but I asked her, have you ever thought about divorce? Yes, it's quite tough as it is, but I have kids. He used to be much kinder. I couldn't understand what she saw in my brother-in-law, but there must be something between them that only they know. It was during such times. Hey, should we start thinking about building our own house? One day, my husband suggested. I was surprised by his words but also felt joy inside. In fact, I've had a small wish since I was a child. To live in a lovely house like those in picture books and to raise a white dog in the garden. I had never told anyone, but I did share this dream with my husband, hiding my embarrassment. That sounds great. He responded enthusiastically. Then we spent time visiting model houses and selecting a home builder, and after a year, our dream home was completed. Let's work hard on the mortgage payments. My husband said, yeah, that's right, I replied with a smile. On the first weekend after our house was completed, my in-laws came to visit as a housewarming gesture. Here, Dad, give them the celebration gift. Excuse us. Oh, what a lovely home, my mother-in-law said, looking quite pleased as if it were her own home. As I gave a wry smile, my father-in-law said, here, this is for celebration, and handed me 2 cans of beer that seemed to have been bought just then. Is this all? My brother-in-law wandered around the house, went into the bedroom on the second floor, and exclaimed, "Bo, this bed is so comfortable," as he jumped onto it. Since the father did that, the kids also got excited, running around and shouting, "There's a cat." The children chased our cat, Candy, throughout the house. Candy, usually a loving cat, was overwhelmed by so many people and hid in a corner of the room. "I'm so sorry, Candy." Looking over at my husband and brother-in-law, they had already started drinking with my in-laws. "Janet, mother-in-law, is rushing for snacks. Can I use the kitchen? And I'm really sorry for scaring the cat," Vanessa said, apologizing. How can such a nice person be in that family? I empathized with Vanessa as if she were my own sister. "I'll do it, so you take a break, Vanessa." I said that, but Vanessa helped with the cooking while taking care of the kids. Steve's grandparents are always quiet and don't talk much. They were as silent as dolls, yet they commented, "What a wonderful home you have." "Really? We're sorry for being so noisy." It was Steve's parents who were noisy, yet the two of them apologized. His grandparents were very polite people. Ultimately, the problem seems to involve Steve's parents, his brother, and probably Steve himself. After that, Steve's parents and brother started visiting our house almost every weekend. They would party loudly until late at night, causing complaints from neighbors, and the police even showed up once. Steve's grandparents and Vanessa, along with her children, haven't visited our house since the housewarming, but Steve's parents come without hesitation, often leaving me with tasks to do. My patience finally reached its limit. Steve began to show his true character gradually. Once, when I was sick with a cold and couldn't cook dinner, I asked Steve, who returned home from work before me, to buy something for dinner on his way back. What Steve brought home was 2 servings of fried chicken. With no appetite, I reflexively said, "Why fried chicken? I can't eat this right now." Without getting angry, Steve replied, "What are you talking about, Janet? You need to eat properly and get better, especially now." If I could eat that, I wouldn't have asked in the first place, I thought to myself. Later, when Steve fell ill, I asked him with a hint of sarcasm, "Do you want fried chicken?" He replied, "No, that's obviously not going to work. What are you thinking?" He laughed as he said that. In the end, this family is selfish and lacks consideration for others. It's as if they've lost their humanity. They can do as they please now, but there will come a time they'd regret it. I decided that in my heart and smiled slyly. A few days later, it was decided that I had to go on a business trip. On the morning of my departure, "I'm off then," I cheerfully said to Steve. "Is your business trip starting today?" "Actually, Vanessa is also on a business trip starting today," he mentioned. "Really? I had no idea. What a coincidence," I replied, to which he laughed. "My parents are in trouble because they don't have anyone to help around the house." Seeing him laugh, I thought to myself, this man is terrible. Days passed busily while I was away, and a major storm hit. I asked Steve about the situation. "I'm fine, but the family home had some leaks due to the rain," he responded. I felt resigned thinking about the aging family home. The day I returned home arrived. As I approached my house from the station, I heard loud laughter. I wondered if someone was having a barbecue in their yard. It was so noisy that I thought it might cause complaints from the neighbors. Then I was shocked to realize the loud voices were coming from my own home. Hesitantly, I opened the door to find a multitude of scattered shoes and walls filled with scribbles. Stunned by this unexpected scene, Steve, already drunk, greeted me. "Oh, Janet, you're back." Angered by his blatant disregard, I stepped into the living room to find Steve's parents and brother also inebriated, with Vanessa busily preparing snacks for them. Steve's grandparents remained as calm as ever, while the children used the walls as their canvas, happily drawing. There was also an unfamiliar young woman present. There was too much information to process. I couldn't organize my thoughts. What exactly is going on here? I tried to have a calm conversation with Steve, asking him quietly, "What? Didn't I tell you? The storm caused a leak in the family home," he replied. "I understand that, but why here?" According to Steve, the family home was severely affected by the storm, and our house was chosen as the refuge for his family. While Vanessa was on a business trip, Steve, his parents, and his brother discussed the next steps. We all thought it would be great to live here together. Steve proposed proudly. What? I couldn't grasp what he was explaining. While I remained silent, Steve's parents cheerfully said, "We're family, and there's enough space, so it's fine." "There's no problem, Janet. Sure, the walls are a bit dirty, but that's just the kids doing," my brother-in-law stated nonchalantly. "Who is that woman?" I asked about the unfamiliar woman relaxing on the sofa. "Oh, her? She's a friend of mine and Vanessa." My brother-in-law turned to Vanessa for confirmation, and she smiled kindly, saying, "Yes, that's right. She got kicked out of her place, and when she asked for advice, my brother said it was okay for her to stay here." My brother-in-law explained, "Nice to meet you." The woman responded, but I was completely lost. In the not-so-large living room, there were 9 adults and 2 children. The house was messy, and the walls were covered in scribbles. It was hard to believe this was a new home. The family was loud, creating an atmosphere like a dormitory. I became furious at the situation. Still, 9 people is way too many. Are we all going to get along and play baseball or something? Then, I realized something. Wait, where's Candy? Our beloved cat, Candy, was nowhere to be found. When I asked Steve and the others, everyone claimed they hadn't seen her. As I searched for Candy, my nephew informed me, well, when Grandpa opened the window to smoke outside, Candy just slipped out. My brother-in-law glared at his son, who shared this information, as if he was saying something outrageous. "Why would you do that? I've told you to be careful when opening the windows," I said, tears welling up. To that, Steve indifferently replied, "Well, if it's about a cat, we can just get a new one. Why are you making such a fuss? If you want a divorce, that's fine by me." Steve said this with a smirk. I challenged his provocative attitude. "Did you just say divorce?" "Yeah, I did. If you're willing to apologize, maybe I'll reconsider," he replied. How he and his family could be so confident, smirking proudly, was beyond me. However, calmly I said, "Is that so? Then sign this," presenting the divorce papers already signed by me. I went to retrieve my packed bags from the room and told Steve calmly, "Have you signed it? Why haven't you signed it yet?" "I'm busy, you know." My preparedness surprised Steve and his parents. As Steve struggled to hide his irritation at my provocation, his mother exclaimed, "Steve, divorce this foolish wife quickly. The house is completed. We don't need her anymore. You'll regret getting divorced," Steve remarked, but there was nothing for me to regret. "What are you talking about? You're the one who'll be in trouble. Just sign the divorce papers," I responded. After ensuring Steve signed the divorce papers, I stored them in my bag, then approached my brother-in-law, presenting another set of papers. "Please sign this as well." "What? When did we get married?" My brother-in-law, laughing, looked at the filled-out wife section. "Hey, Vanessa, this is..." Vanessa, with a cold gaze, urged him to sign the divorce papers. "We're getting a divorce. Please sign it quickly." "Vanessa, this betrayal is unforgivable." My father-in-law condemned, but Vanessa remained resolute in her decision. Even I could see that Vanessa was treated like a domestic worker in her own home. Most of the income she earned was handed over to her husband, except for a small amount allocated to household expenses. He squandered that money as he pleased, and the unknown woman sitting on the sofa turned out to be his mistress. "Janet, it seems my husband is having an affair." Vanessa confided this to me just before Steve proposed building a house. Prioritizing her children, Vanessa had endured in silence. However, she recently discovered that her husband was selling her personal belongings and even the children's toys to profit for himself, pushing her to her breaking point. Then Vanessa shared something with me, igniting my anger. From that moment, we began working towards our divorces. Vanessa focused on gathering evidence of the affair. The business trip she mentioned earlier was actually a lie. We met at the station and went to look for a new place to live. Like me, Vanessa had no parents to turn to but decided to move out of the state based on a job offer from a close friend she had confided in. It was a very pleasant location. Everything went according to plan, and we were at the final step, submitting the divorce papers. I want to take some people out of that miserable place, Vanessa resolved with renewed determination. I saw the strength hidden inside her. Despite appearing fragile on the surface, she possessed a strong heart, suppressed and almost brainwashed by her in-laws' harsh treatment. We staggered our return home, with Vanessa going back first. She informed me that our home had been effectively taken over and my brother-in-law's mistress was living there openly. All our interactions had been an act, fully aware of the circumstances. I told Vanessa, "You don't have to live there anymore. Let the kids enjoy drawing on the walls as much as they want." Seeing my brother-in-law contentedly signing the divorce papers while imagining his new life with his mistress, I felt a cold satisfaction. "Let's go, Vanessa. Grandpa and Grandma, please come with us." I called them out, and they stood up, guiding Vanessa and her children to the entrance. "I thought staying with you people would ruin our lives." Vanessa's words woke me up. "Do as you please from now on," Grandfather coldly told the rest of family while making their way out. It turned out the rest of the family had been dipping into the grandparents' finances as well. Such unforgivable behavior. "Goodbye, take care." As we left, they laughed, saying, "You will regret this." But we ignored them, gathered our belongings, and left the house. Months later, I received a call from my ex-husband. Oh, I forgot to block his number. I had a good idea of what the call was about, but when I answered, a frantic Steve said, "Janet, come back." I couldn't help but laugh. "Come back? We're strangers now." I replied calmly, only for his mother to snatch the phone. "What do you mean? Why aren't you paying the mortgage?" "Excuse me? I don't understand what you're talking about." I feigned ignorance, and she couldn't hide her irritation. It turned out the mortgage was already in arrears. My ex-husband was claiming I was responsible for the missed payments, which was absurd. While I stayed silent, the mother-in-law ranted nonstop. "What's this house? You said your household income was $75,000, right? We should have had a much better home." It's so disappointing for a newly built home. They had planned to acquire that house from the beginning. Vanessa had informed me of my husband and in-law's scheming. "Indeed. But with your son's annual income of $30,000, the bank wouldn't lend much. If we had taken out the mortgage jointly, maybe we could have built a better house." Hearing this, the mother-in-law shouted, "Steve, what's this about? This isn't what we discussed." I could hear my ex-husband and former mother-in-law arguing over the phone. Ignoring that, I hung up the phone and made sure to block his number. My ex-husband always wanted to appear favorable in others' eyes, though not so much with family. But his desire to be seen positively by outsiders was abnormally strong. When I mentioned building a house, I had already been contemplating divorce. Unbeknownst to my ex-husband, I provoked him by saying, "A friend's husband took out a mortgage by himself. That's impressive, isn't it?" Perhaps wanting to make a good impression on the banker, he decided to take out the mortgage himself. It was hard to contain my laughter. He must have been terrified to reveal the truth to his family, but for me, it was a trivial matter. The house that was built disregarded my preferences and was based on my ex-husband's tastes. Hence, I had no attachment to that house. Since my ex-husband didn't cheat, I didn't receive compensation after the divorce. Angered by this fact, I left him with the burden of the mortgage as a form of revenge. I thought he deserved to suffer. Moreover, being able to take Vanessa, whom I considered like a sister, out of that house was my greatest victory. Eventually, the mortgage payments became impossible, and the new house was foreclosed. The interior was covered in graffiti, and the walls were stained yellow from the cigarettes smoked by my former brother-in-law and his mistress. The house was in a state of disrepair, far from what one would expect from a new home. My ex-husband rented a cheap room, but I heard that my former in-laws also moved in with him. It seems he will never be free from them. They are now strangers to me, so I'm not concerned about their fate. The only redeeming quality of my former in-laws was that they didn't harm the children. Other than that, they were the worst kind of people. Vanessa, my former brother-in-law's ex-wife, pursued compensation through legal means against him and his mistress. It appears they managed to pay the amount by borrowing from acquaintances. This was welcome news. The incident made them outcasts in the community, and now their whereabouts are unknown. They haven't repaid their loans, causing dissatisfaction among those they owe. Vanessa is now living fulfilling days working at a friend's company. Her children are growing up healthily, and I wish her all the happiness in the future. My former grandparents seem brighter, as if a burden has been lifted, enjoying a new life with the funds from the sold house and their secret savings. As for me, I requested a transfer to a local office. Surprisingly, my beloved cat Candy is with me. After sharing information about Candy on social media, I found out that a local person had been caring for her. I'm so glad Candy is a friendly cat. Now, I live alone in the house my late father built in my hometown, and with my brother's approval, I'm close to saving enough to build my own home. I hope to introduce someone special at my father's grave someday, and I continue to work hard every day.